Welcome everyone to Second Wind's Deck Tech Premiere. On this first episode, we're going to be looking at one of my absolute favorite deck tech genres, which is big creature, big hit. For this deck, I chose two interchangeable commanders that are Grothama, All-Devouring, and Baru Wormspeaker. For 3 and 2 green, Grothama has other creatures have whenever this creature attacks, you may have it fight Grothama, All-Devouring, and whenever Grothama leaves the battlefield, each player draws a card equal to the amount of damage dealt to Grothama this turn by sources they controlled. Not only does he prohibit enemies from attacking for fear of Grothama killing him, he also has the potential to be a massive card draw engine. Next up, we got Baru Wormspeaker. For 2 and 2 green, you get a human druid with worms you control get +2/+2 and have trample. He also has pay 7 and a green, tap, create a 4/4 green worm creature token. This ability costs X less to activate, whereas X is the greatest power among worms you control. So with the right board state, with Baru Wormspeaker, you could potentially pay 1 green and tap him once per turn to get a 4/4. And with his first passive, it'll be much easier to get that cost way down. Next up, we're going to be talking about all the big worms we're going to be slapping onto the battlefield. First on our list is Defiler of Vigor. For 3 and 2 green, you get a 6/6 worm with trample. As an additional cost to cast green permanent spells, you may pay 2 life. Those spells cost 1 green less to cast if you paid life this way. This effect only reduces the amount of green mana you play. Whenever you cast a green permanent spell, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Next, we have Pelika Worm. For 4 and 3 green, we get a 7/7 worm with trample again. When Pelika Worm enters the battlefield, you gain 7 life, and when Pelika Worm dies, you draw a card. Next on the list, we got Tempting Worm. For 1 and a green, you get a 5/5 worm with, when Tempting Worm comes into play, each opponent may put any number of artifact, creature, enchantment, or land cards from his or her hand into play. Up next, we got Siege Worm. For 5 and 2 green, you get a 5/5 worm with Convoke and Trample. Next up, we got a pretty unique effect in Panglacial Worm. For 5 and 2 green, you get a 9/5 worm with Trample, and while you're searching for your library, you may play Panglacial Worm from your library. Next up, we got Impervious Great Worm. For 7 and 3 green, you get a 16/16 worm with Convoke and Indestructible. Sifter Worm comes next. For 5 and 2 green, you get a 7/7 worm with Trample. And when Sifting Worm enters the battlefield, scry 3, then reveal the top card of your library. You gain life equal to that card's converted mana cost. Up next, we have Bookworm. For 7 and a green, you get a 7/7 worm with Trample. And when Bookworm enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life and draw a card. Pay 2 and a green, put Bookworm from your graveyard into your library, 3rd from the top. Next group starting off with Pathbreaker Worm. For 4 and 2 green, you get a 6/4 worm with Soul Bond. As long as Pathbreaker Worm is paired with another creature, both creatures have trample. Next up, we got Elfhame Worm. For 4 and a green, you get a 5/4 worm with Vigilance and Trample. Greater Sandworm is a 7/7 that costs 5 and 2 green. And Greater Sandworm can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. It also has cycling 2. Next up, Plated Slag Worm. For 4 and 3 green, you get an 8/8 worm with Hexproof. Next worm up is Vigorspore Worm. For 5 and a green, you get a 6/4 worm with Undergrowth. When Vigorspore Worm enters the battlefield, target creature gains Vigilance and gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. Vigorspore Worm can't be blocked by more than 1 creature. Next group on the big hits list starts off with Deathcoil Worm. For 6 and 2 green, you get a 7/6 worm, with you may have Deathcoil Worm assign as combat damage as though it weren't blocked. Up next, we have Metamorphic Worm. For 3 and 2 green, you get a 3/3 worm with Threshold. Next on the list is Soul Swallower. For 2 and 2 green, you get a 3/3 worm with Trample and Delirium. At the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, put 3 +1/+1 counters on Soul Swallower. Next up, we got Witherscale Worm. For 4 and 2 green, you get a 9/9 worm with whenever Witherscale Worm blocks or becomes blocked by a creature, that creature gains Wither until end of turn. When Witherscale Worm deals damage to an opponent, remove all -1/-1 counters from it. Last up for this group is Pouncing Worm. For 3 and a green, you get a 3/3 worm with Kicker 3. If the kicker cost was paid, Pouncing Worm comes into play with 3 +1/+1 counters on it and haste. Next list slithers off with Ravenous Lindworm. For 4 and 2 green, you get a 6/6 worm with when Ravenous Lindworm enters the battlefield, you gain 4 life. Next up, we got Elderscale Worm. For 4 and 3 green, you get a 7/7 worm with Trample. When Elderscale Worm enters the battlefield, if your life total is less than 7, your life total becomes 7. As long as you have 7 or more life, Damage that would reduce your life total to less than 7 reduces it to 7 instead. Next up, we got Worldspine Worm. For 8 and 3 green, you get a 15/15 worm with trample. When Worldspine Worm dies, put 3 5/5 green worm creature tokens with trample onto the battlefield. When Worldspine Worm is put into the graveyard from anywhere, shuffle it into its owner's library. So this is a really big reoccurring effect right there. Up next, we got Bellowing Tangleworm. For 3 and 2 green, you get a 4/4 worm with Intimidate. Other green creatures you control have Intimidate. Next on the list is Dirt Coil Worm. For 4 and a green, you get a 3/4 worm with whenever an opponent plays a land, put a +1/+1 counter on Dirt Coil Worm. The last 4 for your worm creature card starts up with Boneyard Worm. For 1 and a green, you get a star with Boneyard Worm's power and toughness are equal to the number of creatures in your graveyard. Next up is Penumbra Worm. For 5 and 2 green, you get a 6/6 worm with trample, and when Penumbra Worm dies, create a 6/6 black worm creature token with trample. Second to last, we have Symbiotic Worm. For 5 and 3 green, you get a 7/7 worm with when Symbiotic Worm dies, put 7 1/1 green insect creatures into the battlefield. Last but not least, we got Bramble Worm. For 6 and a green, you get a 7/6 worm with reach and trample. When Bramble Worm enters the battlefield, you gain 5 life. Pay 2 and a green, exile Bramble Worm from your graveyard, you gain 5 life again. Now moving on to the non-worm creatures, you have Karametra's Acolyte. For 3 and a green, you get a 1/4 human druid with tap, add amount of green to your mana pool equal to your devotion to green. Up next are essential card draw engines with Soul of the Harvest and Beast Whisperer. For 4 and 2 green, you get a 6/6 elemental with trample, and whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. Next on the card draw list is Beast Whisperer. For 2 and 2 green, you get a 2/3 elf druid with whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. Here are some other green creatures that will help beef up all of your other creatures. First up, we got Goreclaw. For 3 and a green, you get a 4/3 bear with creature spells you cast with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast. And whenever Goreclaw attacks, each creature you control with power 4 or greater gets +1/+1 and gains trample until end of turn. Next up, we got a way to cheat creatures out with Elvish Piper. For 3 and a green, you get a 1/1 elf shaman with pay 1 green and tap. You may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. Last up on creatures, we got Brawn. For 3 and a green, you get a 3/3 incarnation with trample. And as long as Brawn is in your graveyard and you have a forest, creatures you control have trample. Let's move on to Planeswalkers with Nissa Who Shakes the World. For 3 and 2 green, you get a Planeswalker with whenever you tap a forest for mana, add an additional forest, essentially doubling your mana. The only thing you really want to use this Planeswalker for is its passive, and if you can get it off, it's -8. Its -8 is, you get an emblem with lands you control have indestructible, search your library for any number of forest cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. Up next, we got Garruk, Primal Hunter. The main reason I put him into this deck is for its -3 and its -6. Its -3 is draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. Its -6 is create a 6/6 green worm creature token for each land you control. Starting off our instance list, we have Return to Nature. For 1 and a green, you choose 1. Destroy target artifact, destroy target enchantment, or exile target card from graveyard. Next up, we have Rapid Vigor. For 1 and a green, you regenerate each creature you control. Great for swinging out. Next up, we have Momentous Fall. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature. You may draw cards equal to the sacrifice creature power, then you gain life equal to its toughness. Next up, we have Krosan Grip. For 2 and a green, you get a split second, destroy target artifact or enchantment. Moving on to sorceries, we'll start off with Nidlea's Intervention. For X and 2 green, you get to choose 1. Search your library for up to X land cards, reveal them, put them onto your hand, and shuffle your library. Or Nidlea's Intervention deals twice X damage to each creature with flying. Up next, we have Boundless Realms. For 6 and a green, you essentially double your mana. Here come the green staples with Kodama's Reach. For 2 and a green, you search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal those cards, put 1 onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand, and shuffle. Next staple on the list is Explosive Vegetation. For 3 and a green, you search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, and shuffle. Last up is Cultivate. For 2 and a green, you search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal those cards, put 1 onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand, and shuffle. Moving on to the next group of sorceries, we have Overwhelming Stampede. For 3 and 2 green, until end of turn, creatures you control gain trample and get +X/+X, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Up next, we have another card for the theme of the deck with Crush of Worms. For 6 and 3 green, you can put 3 6/6 green worm creature tokens into play. It also has flashback 9 and 3 green. Next on the list is Shamanic Revelations. For 3 and 2 green, you draw a card for each creature you control. You also gain 4 life for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. Last on the list of sorceries, you have another thematic spell with Worm Calling. For X and a green, put an XX green worm creature token into play with buyback 3. Kicking off our enchantments, we have Garruk's Uprising. For 2 and a green, when Garruk's Uprising enters the battlefield, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. Creatures you control have trample, and whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. Next up on the enchantments is Colossal's Majesty. For 2 and a green, you get an enchantment with, at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. Third up, we have Zendikar's Resurgence. For 5 and 2 green, you get an enchantment with, whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana to your mana pool of any type that land produced. Whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. Another effective way to double your mana. Last up on this group of enchantments, you have Elemental Bond. For 2 and a green, you get an enchantment with, whenever a creature with power 3 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. Next group of enchantments is less about drawing cards and more about beefing up your green creatures. Here we'll start this off with Primal Rage. For 1 and a green, you get an enchantment with, creatures you control have trample. Next up is Mighty Emergence. For 2 and a green, you get an enchantment with, whenever a creature with power 5 or greater comes into play under your control, you may put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. Next up we have Unnatural Growth. For 1 and 4 green, you get an enchantment with, at the beginning of each combat, double the power and toughness of each creature you control until end of turn. Last up on all of our enchantments is Sandworm Convergence. For 6 and 2 green, you get an enchantment with, creatures with flying can't attack you or planeswalkers you control. At the beginning of your end step, create a 5/5 green worm creature token. Now here come the artifacts. Starting off, we have Soul Ring. Everyone knows what that does. Next up, we got Belb's Portal. As Belb's Portal comes into play, choose a creature type. Pay 3 and tap, put creature card of the chosen type from your hand into play. Next up, yet again thematic, is Worm's Tooth. For 2, you get an artifact with, whenever a player casts a green spell, you may gain 1 life. Up next, we got Dragon Throne of Tarkir. For 4, you get a legendary artifact equipment with equip creature has defender and pay 2 and tap. Other creatures you control gain trample and +X/+X until end of turn, where X is this creature's power. Last up on this round of artifacts, we have Swiftfoot Boots. For 2, you get an equipment with equip creature has hexproof and haste. First up on this group, we have Cage Sun. For 6, you get an artifact with, as Cage Sun enters the battlefield, choose a color. Creatures of the chosen color get +1/+1, and whenever a land's ability causes you to add 1 or more mana of the chosen color, add 1 additional mana to that color. Essentially, yet again, doubling your mana. Next up, we have Coat of Arms. For 5, you get an artifact with each creature gets +1/+1 for each other creature of the battlefield that shares at least 1 creature type with it. Next on the list is Rona's Monument. For 3, you get a legendary artifact with green creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Whenever you cast a creature spell, target creature you control gets +2/+2 and gains trample until end of turn. Last up on our artifacts, we have Obelisk of Erd. For 6, you get an artifact with Convoke. As Obelisk of Erd enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Creatures you control of the chosen type get +2/+2. Last but not least, we have our lands. I kept this plain and simple, so we'll start it off with Reliquary Tower. You have no maximum hand size, tap, add 1 colorless. Next up is Rogue's Passage. Tap for 1 colorless, but also pay 4, target creature can't be blocked this turn. It's an easy way to sneak through big hits. And at the very end, we have 31 Forests. Nice and simple. With all of these cards put together, you're looking at a total price of about $143 on TCG Player if you have the optimized cart. You can of course sub things out to make them cheaper for other green worm creatures. Some enchantments are pretty pricey, but overall I think this is a pretty good bang for your buck. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you like these type of videos, please make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and tune in next time on Second Wind EDH.